Welcome to Game Changers Live from Miami, Florida. My name is Sergio Tigera. I'm your host. And each and every week, we bring you someone who has been a game changer in their field and who's touched the lives of thousands to get their perspective on their journey, their mindset, their struggles and successes so that we can inspire you on your journey. So let's get started right now. And welcome to Game Changers Live. You can catch us each and every episode here from our home studio at Florida International University's College of Communications, Architecture, and the Arts. Thank you so much for making Game Changers a top 2% podcast ranked globally. And make sure to share this and like with somebody who needs to hear it, because you could be the game changer in their lives. And so my guest today is living legend, Mr. David Lawrence.
Good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Good to have you, my friend. So David is a former publisher of the Detroit Free Press, as well as the Miami Herald. Legendary newsman, has been all over the country, including the Washington Post and other notable areas, making impacts in the community. And he is also someone who has had an even greater impact in the community and amongst, in the lives of children after he retired. Which, so normally you go and retire and, play golf and hit, the good life. But I think you got into something that is, has had such a even bigger impact than your career in that.
So I had a wonderful life in newspapers and worked at 7 newspapers for 35 years as a reporter, editor, publisher. And in 1996, I was the publisher of the Miami Herald, and Lawton Childs, then the governor, asked me to chair a statewide task force on early childhood, school readiness, et cetera. And I did that for 2 years while still being publisher of the Herald. And I came to believe that the subject spoke to the future of the United States of America. If we can get children off to a good start, we're going to have a more successful, giving, caring nation. And so subsequently, 24 years have passed since I retired, and I've focused mostly on children, but I'm involved in a lot of other things.
So you recently wrote a book called A Dedicated Life, and which is a fantastic tribute to your life. I mean, from the early beginnings of your parents and, living in New York City, then moving to a farm, and a lot of the things that you learned from there. And as you went on, the number of values that really stuck with you throughout your life that helped guide you.
So
right?
I grew up in an extraordinary home. I'm one of 9 children, was baptized at St. Patrick's in New York, a simple country parish church in New York. I'm the second oldest of 9. My parents were romantics. They didn't know anything about farming, but they bought a farm for $3,000, 33 acres, and said, this is what we're going to do. And it was a great way to grow up. The farm ultimately didn't do so well, and my mother had some illness, so we moved to Florida, and so my father started all over again. But I grew up in the kind of home where all 11 of us would sit around the table. My father would quiz us on government and politics. We were expected to make something out of ourselves. We didn't have a lot of money. Books were most of the presents we got for Christmas or birthdays and so forth and so on. And I was the kind of child at age 11 who, when we got the World Book Encyclopedia, I would sit and just read the encyclopedia because it was fun to know things. I wasn't looking up something specific.
You're curious.
Liked to do it. I was very curious. And I lived in a time and a place where I drove a tractor when I was 10 years old. Now, OSHA would get on your parents' back fiercely if you let a child drive a tractor. But George W. Bush once talked about the soft bigotry of low expectations. If you think people can do something, whether they're 10 or 2.5 or 50 or whatever, there's a lot within you that you can do. So my father always used to worry about me. Maybe he's the kind of young man who will try to save the world. And my father warned me about that because, of course, no one presently is saving the world, but he always thought, boy, you could make a difference. So this is probably naive, but I'm as optimistic and idealistic as I was when I was 10 years old, and now I'm 81. So, and I'm not saving my energy for the next world. I'm going to use it here.
That optimism is a decision that you make consciously and or unconsciously, so just part of the very fabric of your nature. Is that something that you think we can just switch on and say, hey, I'm going to decide to be optimistic? I can decide to.
I don't think so.
How do you do that?
You got to hold it. It's got to be in your soul somewhere.
Yeah.
And
do you think we all have that in our souls somewhere? Because there's some people are just
no, I do,
pessimistic in nature.
Life's good and life's tough, and a lot of children grow up in terribly tough circumstances.
Right.
When you know the statistics that, for instance, 1 out of every 3 girls and 1 out of every 5 boys is sexually abused.
That's unbelievable.
What a horror, and what impact that it has. And we have a lot of evidence that kids who are abused, not only abused physically, but if you abuse emotionally, mentally, all those early years are so critical. And I was fortunate not to have those kind of years. And the farm sort of goes broke. My mother is ill. We moved to Florida because it's warm. My mother had a disease called Raynaud's disease, which affects the extremities of the hands, the feet, etc. So we moved to Florida when I was 14 years old. And my father had to start all over again. He had been in the newspaper business earlier before we moved to a farm. And all 9 of us were graduated from either Florida or Florida State. There were only 3 state universities then. There are now 12. When we moved to Florida, there were 2 universities for white folks, University of Florida and Florida State, and 1 university for black folks, Florida A&M, which, interestingly enough, I was on the board in recent years for 6 years. On that board, and if you saw a picture of the 13-member board, you would spot me immediately. But all of us graduated, many from one or the other, and many of them with advanced degrees. We were expected to make something of ourselves, and I grew up at a time with 6 sisters, all 6 of whom became teachers because women at that time were more likely to become teachers or nurses. And now you have more than half of law and medical schools are women. So it's a sea change in.
Right. Yeah. Now, you wrote a book recently called The Dedicated Life. And one of the things that stood out to me, I remember the story as to, when you finished your career in a newspaper, one of the stories you told was that you were talking to some young kids, and you told the story about Ronald McDonald, and that's...
No, not Ronald McDonald.
Sorry,
Old
McDonald. Old McDonald. I'm sorry about that. Not Ronald McDonald.
Ronald McDonald was a clown.
Old McDonald,
and Old McDonald was a farmer, right? You got it now.
Yes, sir. But Old McDonald, that he had a farm, and then one of the kids didn't realize what one of the animals looked like, right?
Yes. So on the cover of the book, I'm reading this book in Miami, as a matter of fact, and I'm at a child care and after school center, and I've got 21 kids sort of in a semicircle around me, and they've got bright and eager faces, and I read a book. When I read a book to children, I show them the pictures, and on the front cover is Mr. McDonald, and Mr. McDonald has on a red and white check shirt. He has on Levi's or whatever they're called, dungarees, overall, and he has on a straw hat. And clearly he's a farmer. That would be the kind of outfit that somebody would have. And there were, through the straw hat, 2 bunny ears peering up. And I asked the children, well, what kind of animal is this? And not one knew it was a bunny rabbit. And that's frightening. These are 3 and 4-year-olds. And I think I have grandchildren who might not know everything, surely don't, but they do know what a bunny rabbit is,
Sure.
and they know they would know what a giraffe is and lots of other kinds of things. So kids can get terribly far behind early. 85% of brain growth occurs by the age of 3. Get those years right, you're probably going to have momentum all their life. But just imagine those children with whom I was going to kindergarten and sitting in a classroom, and they're already way behind, and they're seeing other kids who are rocking and rolling and they're doing fine. And think about the blow to your own ego and
you think you're not good
self-awareness
enough,
and
you're not smart enough.
self-esteem. And so you say, I can't do this work. All the other kids are doing this. And so you act up and out, and we're off to the races.
Sure.
And a lot of teachers special track children and decide this child's not going to really make it, etc., which is tragic. So if you're nervous from time to time, and I hope you are, I am, that's fine as long as you have the chutzpah to go ahead and do something.
Right.
But you're 4 or 5 years old and you've already decided, I can't do this. That's an American tragedy.
Absolutely. And it's not just happening here. It's all over the country. No. Yeah. Having kids myself, I have, like we were talking about, I have a 5-year-old son and a 10-year-old daughter. And they were fortunate enough to have the VPK program, which is something that you help spearhead, and we'll get to that. But it's incredibly important, like you said, and we're so fortunate in this state being one of only a few that really have that free VPK available, because there's a lot of folks that can't afford, a proper daycare.
There are now 150,000 4-year-olds in the program, and this country's future. We got 335 million people living here. This country's future success, not just economic, but in other ways, depends on building a movement for all children. The same principles that raise your 2 children, or my 5, or my grandchildren, are the same principles that everyone needs, which is the right blend of health and education and nurturing and love. And children without love are in terrible shape and frequently do bad things to other people and to themselves. Sure. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah. So when you finished at the Herald, you had a period of time where you were thinking about, what am I going to do next? Because obviously you're not one to just rest on your laurels, and you found this issue that you were passionate about, because you have your own children, you've seen how important that is.
But I didn't really know how important it was, and had a lot to learn. So Lawton Childs, who I think was a very good governor and a highly decent human being, had a grandchild by the same name, Lawton, who was born very prematurely, had a bunch of challenges, including developmental challenges. And that child is now a web marketing executive in Atlanta and is in his 40s. Doing the right things early made an enormous difference. So Lawton Childs cared a lot about this issue. I knew nothing about this issue. Zero. It had never crossed my mind. I think my children had the right principles with them, but I didn't know they were principles. So I learned a lot. I learned so much that I decided to leave one career. This was not financially a great move, I promise you. Leave one career and go do something entirely different. But try not to use the word retirement with me, because I don't ever see myself retired. It's not so much about money and that sort of compensation. It's all about, you only got so many years in this world. How are you going to use them? What difference are you going to make? What example are you going to set, and so forth? So pre-K comes about because of that. We were one of the first 4 states in the country to have pre-K free, available to everyone. I hooked up with the then mayor, Alex Pinellas.
Right.
And we did a lot of things together, including the pre-K constitutional amendment. And then I became very interested in what now is called the Children's Trust.
Mhm.
And it had first been tried in 1988 in what was then called Dade County, not Miami-Dade. And Janet Reno and others led a campaign. She was then the Dade state attorney, later become, of course, the attorney general. And she was, I promise you, a good human being, and her own life was focused on what do we do about crime and justice. And so she led a campaign to pass a half-mil property tax and argued fundamentally we need to help children here, here, and here. It failed 2-1. I argued 14 years later, when I led a campaign to pass it, that it was about everyone's child. You don't build a movement based on those people. You build a movement based on us, ours.
Our children.
And we passed it twice. It's now in perpetuity. And this year, the Children's Trust will spend more than $180 million in this one American community to help people succeed in school and in life.
It's incredible. I was in reading the book. One of the things that amazed me was your ability to garner a coalition of leaders, of community leaders, of policymakers, of business people. You raised tens of millions of dollars over the last, 15, 20 years. Did you initially understand the undertaking and the depth and breadth of what it would take to get it to this point? Or
remember I told you a few minutes ago that I'm insecure in some ways, so I wasn't sure. I knew it had been defeated 2-1. I worked very closely with a political strategist named Sergio Ben-Dixon, no longer living, but a great political strategist. And the early polling showed we had 40% support. You can't win any election with 40% support. So in fact, we put a 5-year sunset on it. We said, try it for 5 years. If you don't like it, dump it. So we ended up, I raised a chunk of money in a PAC. My vision was this was about everyone's child, though certain children and certain families need more help and they ought to get more help. And so we passed it 2-1. But the 5 years went into being in 2003. The 5 years ended in 2008. So then it was on the ballot in the third trimester of 2008. And this country was going to hell in a handbasket. We had a brutal presidential campaign. Financial institutions were imploding. This is a tax. So what do we do about all of that? And I raised more than twice as much money to get this passed, and argued again that it was building a movement about everyone's child. This time we passed it with 85.4% of the vote. And it wasn't because people suddenly liked children and they didn't like them in 1988. And it was not accidentally called the Children's Trust. That is the fundamental issue in Miami and America, the issue of trust. And we passed it overwhelmingly in perpetuity, and it hasn't had a whiff of a scandal. There are great people who are running this, and it makes an extraordinary difference.
It's an incredible story. If you haven't read the book, you gotta check it out, because it really does highlight all these important aspects. And you're underplaying the amount of work and strategic planning that went into like the thinking of this and executing it.
So I'm going back to insecurity again. I'm insecure about things. Can I do things?
Right.
And so I was nervous about what could be done. I worked for 2 years sort of undercover, privately, covertly, and worked hard. My job wasn't to beat the opposition. My job was perhaps to neutralize any opposition. And ultimately, it paid off, and now it pays off in higher quality after-school care and higher quality child care and lots of other things.
Right. So looking at early childhood development now, times have changed, quite a bit. Obviously, things are happening at a faster pace with technology and kids. I worry myself with my, my 5-year-old, now my 10-year-old, obviously a little older, but even when she was younger, is the dependency on electronics, on YouTube, on the iPads and the phones and everything else like that. And the impact that's having, the developmental impact, right? I think
I think you ought to be worried.
Yeah.
I think it's a crucial subject. I mean, the fundamental of participating in society, frankly, is reading. And we've got an extraordinary problem in Florida and in America with an immense number of children who can't read. So more than 40% of the children in fourth grade in Florida cannot read at minimally proficient levels.
Wow.
And we got about 32% of adults in this country are college graduates. And I don't think everybody has to go to college. And I think there are wonderful things you can do without a college education, but you certainly want educated and informed people. And then if people think you pick up an iPhone and read 2 stories that you've suddenly somehow read the newspaper really wrong, I want people to be not only go to high school and college, but I want to be lifelong learners. I average 2 books a week myself. They're mostly biographies and history, and I read a lot about, frankly, matters of prejudice, racism, anti-Semitism, etc., because I have been in 56 countries, and I've never been in a country that didn't have that problem.
Right.
And you'll never overcome it unless you confront yourself. We weren't born with crap in our soul. We had to learn it somehow or other. And I'll frequently ask an audience, why do I want you to read books? And somebody will say to learn something, you can think of the various reasons. I want them to know how you get ahead. In my case, in America, it's by building relationships. So if I've been in 56 countries, including places like Democratic Republic of Congo and Bangladesh, I've seen a lot of things. I've been to Auschwitz and so forth and so on. I've interviewed Fidel Castro for 5.5 hours. I've interviewed the President of the United States on Air Force One and so forth. My ability to have relationships means I need to connect with people. I need to know some things. And for instance, the book I'm reading right now, which has gotten extraordinary reviews, positive, is called King of Life. It's by an author named Jonathan Eig. The New York Times called it a couple of weeks ago the definitive biography of Dr. King. Now, I've read a lot of things about Dr. King over the years, but I'm eager to learn more. What made him tick? I read a lot of biographies. Other people read so-called leadership books. Well, I read leadership books too, and they're called biographies. And so, for instance, I just read a book on Helen Keller. Well, what do we know about Helen Keller? A lot of people have seen the movie, learned about her famous teacher, knew that she was deaf and blind and
mute.
Couldn't speak, and yet was a brilliant human being. Well, that's what we know about her. But do you know that 100+ years ago, she was also a person who fought hard for women's right to vote and was an early voice on the subject of racism?
Oh, I didn't know that.
No, most people wouldn't know that. But I want people, the other day I'm with some person who's in college. She's smart, comes from a good, caring, educated family. I said, who's your favorite president? So she gives me Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Well, what did she know about Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Well, he got us out of the Depression. Well, that's not actually really so. World War II got us out of the Depression because we had jobs for people when 16 million Americans were serving in the American military. We need somebody to make the guns and the tanks. And it's much more complicated
Right.
than that. I wanted her to know that we had perfectly awful policies on immigration when people were trying to get out of Nazi Germany. We were not a very thoughtful country on this. I want her to know these kind of things. And then we talked about Teddy Roosevelt, who's on Mount Rushmore. Well, Teddy did a lot of great things, but Teddy also believed in eugenics. And when Hitler writes Mein Kampf in the early 1920s, My Struggle, Hitler deeply admired the United States because we knew how to handle black people.
Wow.
Exactly. Wow. People need to know these things. So Teddy Roosevelt, Food and Drug Administration, national parks, know how to use the bully pulpit, trust buster, etc. But there's another part of him. So that's a book on leadership.
Absolutely.
Including the flaws of all human beings, and maybe even including you, and certainly including me.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting though, because it takes a certain amount of curiosity, right, to start reading these books and kind of reading history, because we think, okay, it just happened in the past. Today's
now?
Who cares? You know, it doesn't mean anything today. It's in the past. But there are so many amazing lessons in there that if you really put yourself in their shoes, you can start to see things kind of repeat themselves.
Sure. And so I do a book group at home with about 25 people, come every 5 Sundays or so in the evening. And we take a book. We're going to do the Dr. King book, but we did a book in the last couple of years about Hitler. I want people to know that Hitler came to power legally. Wasn't the stormtroopers who took him in, the business community. We can control this guy, and he's better than the communists.
Yeah.
Well, and then later 60 million people are dead in the world. I want people to know where we came from, what the implications of that are. I want people to read. I don't want people really to be either an MSNBC or a Fox person. I want them to sample a large number of things, figure out ways they can learn. We don't listen very well in this country now. Have you played around with ChatGPT yet?
Oh, of course. Many times.
It's
incredible.
Incredible, amazing, and some scary.
Yeah, absolutely scary. Now, and to a quick point there, you mentioned, you know, the news stations. They are more and more becoming divisive, kind of either left wing or right wing propaganda machines. How do you know, you're a newsman, right? You always try to be fair and balanced, make sure you're kind of presenting all sides of the story. How or what strategies would you recommend to people these days to get their news in a way that, you know, look at different sources, read a number of different sources on the topic?
But you're suggesting the appropriate answer. I need to look at a lot of different things. I get on paper, I get the Miami Herald and the New York Times each morning. On Saturdays, I also get the Wall Street Journal. I read books. I look at Politico and Axios websites. I see the Washington Post website every morning. I got to have a lot of things coming at me. Now, I'll confess to this. I don't watch TV news anymore because it's so focused on people crapping on other human beings, and my life is too short, and print is colder, and I like the coldness of it. Life's so short. I'm not interested
wasting
in
time on that.
People dumping on other human beings. And one of the perils of social media, and it is significant, is that some of it could be highly inaccurate and deliberately, and yet appear very real. And unless you're seeing a wide variety of things, you're getting a very small picture of what actually might be happening. And now people have found it, obviously. People who are in power or want to be in power, willing to do and say all sorts of things, and this country ends up being divided. here we are, this extraordinarily inspirational, on many occasions, nation, that the republic is going to be in danger unless people figure out what we can
How
do
to come together.
Yeah.
Right. So as we start to wrap this up, the question that I always ask my guests is, was there a time or an event in life that was a game changer for you, that either, lit the light bulb or changed the trajectory of your thinking or your life, something that was a pivotal moment in your life? That
the one thing that I've already mentioned is the governor saying, would you head this task force, of which I knew it. I have a lifelong problem of saying yes to people. And so I lead a twofold life. My wife, whom I love very much, we've been married for 60 years.
Wow.
This December, has Alzheimer's now. She's doing pretty well.
Okay.
But it's a reminder that none of us is in control of life, and we're blessed in a whole bunch of ways. And then 5 children have been just warm and loving. The grandchildren call often to talk to their grandmother or to me. I get my joy in pretty simple ways. So I don't play golf. I don't play tennis. I don't belong to country clubs. Reading a good book is a big plus. I like people, so I'm with a lot of people all the time. I can get more things done if I know more people.
Right.
And so I lead a very purposeful life, and I'm a really good learner as long as it's not about abstract things. So if you say, how'd you do in geometry in 10th grade? I was awful. I passed, but I was awful, because to this moment, I still know what a triangle is and a square is and a rectangle, and that's all I really need to know out of that. But I'd much rather spend my time reading about Helen Keller or Abraham Lincoln.
Right, right. Well, David, you're a champion for children, for parents as well. You've impacted the lives of so many, including my own. So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, the effort that you made, because you didn't have to do it, right? And it's something that that drove you to do it. My
soul compels me to do it, and I lead a life of significant blessings. And if my children, my grandchildren, my wife are all right, I can put up with the rest of the stuff in this world.
A Dedicated Life. Make sure to pick it up. You can get the paperback. It's also on Amazon.
No paperback. Hardcover.
Hardcover. Sorry about that. Audible and Kindle as well.
And you can get it at Books and Books, or you can get it on Amazon.
Yeah.
Easy to get. And the money goes to the Children's Movement of Florida. It doesn't go to me.
Oh, there you go. The impact continues throughout. So, David, thank you so much for being on Game Changers, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure having you.
If you loved what you heard in today's episode of Game Changers, please subscribe and rate us. The lessons and the stories in these podcasts are immensely valuable, so I invite you to share them with a friend who needs to hear it. You may end up being the game changer in their lives.